let's start with, obviously, the news of the week. So Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes penned an essay published this week arguing that Facebook should be broken up. What did you think when you read the essay? What's your reactions? What's your thoughts?
So I don't actually know Chris. He left well before my time. I only know kind of like the mature big Facebook for personal experience. I think there are strong arguments for breaking up Facebook from a competition policy standpoint, right? So, if you drive up and down 101, the freeway is lined with the bleached skulls of the dinosaurs that have come before, right? Like you have the fast new animals taking down the dinosaur companies and living within their skeletons. This is actually Facebook. Part of its campus is the old Sun campus. The back of the Facebook sign still says Sun Microsystems. My first experience with what is now the Googleplex was doing a interview for an internship at SGI, right? And so, we've traditionally had this cycle of internal disruption in Silicon Valley that in some areas seems to have been disrupted by the incumbents, right? I would say probably the GAFA incumbents, right? The Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon have gone to the point where they have such access to capital. And in the consumer space, what is critically important is to try to be able to know where people are going. And Mark Zuckerberg has more knowledge about what people want to do online than anybody else on the planet.
Do you think Mark Zuckerberg has too much control over speech?
Well, so I'm going to go back. So I think on a competition perspective, breaking up Facebook is an argument you can make because his ability to take out his competitors like Instagram and WhatsApp is unprecedented, and that really does reduce competition, right? There's an alternate universe in which he has to compete against Instagram and WhatsApp, and maybe that's better for competition. On all of these other complaints about Facebook, they are not solvable by antitrust, right? These other issues are fundamental issues about if you're going to give billions of people speech, what are the limits to that speech? Who has responsibility for defining what they're allowed to do, and what kind of operational components do you put in place? And that is a fundamental problem that our society hasn't really figured out. And so while I think Mark Zuckerberg has too much power himself, the complaint that a lot of people have is actually very confused here because most of the people who are criticizing Facebook who support antitrust are saying he's not using it enough, right? Like the common complaint is really Facebook is too powerful and I want that power to be used to squash people I don't like online, right? Which is like kind of a deeply confused argument. And breaking up Facebook does not solve that problem. It just creates 3 or 4 or 5 companies that have to make that decision. So I think it's fine to break up Facebook, but if people think that's going to solve these issues, what it'll do is create a more competitive marketplace, but it's not going to fix like the fundamental speech and safety problems.
So let's talk about that in a second. So would you, from a competition perspective, if you were head of the FTC, would you break up Facebook?
I mean, it's hard to tell. I'm not a lawyer. I don't really understand what kind of it's obviously under like US competition law, it's very hard to show that consumers are harmed when all these free products are still free. Yeah. But like I think breaking up the company to create a more competitive marketplace is a reasonable thing. But that's realistically though, if you break up Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, you're increasing some of the big high-end competition. I don't know if that unlocks the social media space for new startups. Right, and I think that's the bigger problem there is that the ability of those GAFA companies to now beat anybody at their own game is pretty spectacular. Like probably the most anti-competitive thing Facebook's done was destroy Snapchat with Instagram stories. And it's very hard from a regulatory perspective to say, well, don't be really good at product. Right? And Facebook is so good at product and making products people like that if somebody else competes with them, whether they're broken up or not, the resultant companies will still probably dominate the space.
In this trade-off between privacy and security, right, or privacy and safety, let's say, do you think, one, that Facebook has got the balance wrong, and then 2, do you think there should be substantial FTC oversight on that trade-off?
So, I mean, the FTC, I don't think has any there's no regulatory backing for any oversight on the security side. On privacy, there's going to be the problem in the United States is we don't know what our privacy law is, right? So we don't have a substantive privacy law in the United States. What you end up is the FTC playing Calvin ball, where they create rules. Those rules only apply to specific companies. They enforce them via consent decrees, and then they punish them. But that punishment is not spread equally. And what we really need in the United States is we need a substantive privacy law that says these are the rules of the road, and then we need rulemaking that turns that into what does it mean. And so Europe has the first, they have a substantive privacy law. They don't really have the second, because in Europe, GDPR is being interpreted by 28 different data protection authorities. So nobody has the authority to really say, this is how you interpret these 4 articles of GDPR towards your cookie policy. And that's where we have to end up as a country, is that if you're a 12, 15 person company, these privacy laws are fine for the Googles and Facebooks because they can afford hundreds of lawyers to work on it. The real problem that we're ending up right now in privacy is that if you're a small company, you don't know what the rules are for you. And that is going to slow competition. It's also going to make people spend money way too early on privacy advice when they really should be focusing on product. And I think we can do a better job in the United States, but I don't think the FTC has the authority right now. And on the safety side, what's going on is that there is a real balance between privacy and safety, right? So if you want Facebook to stop bad things from happening, they have to see the bad things happening and they have to know about the people who are doing the bad things. That is just a fundamental trade-off, right? So if you give everybody anonymity, there will be a lot more bad stuff. If you give everybody end-to-end encrypted communication, it is more difficult for the company to moderate it. Not impossible, but much more difficult. And that is a hard trade-off. And the thing that's going on is all the laws are coming down on the privacy side. None of the laws are coming down on the safety side. And so you see Zuckerberg's response to this is, okay, great, we're going to encrypt everything. We're going to make everything private and ephemeral, which is going to greatly increase people's privacy, but it's going to have safety impacts that I don't think people have understood yet.
Last question for you on this line. So Senators Blumenthal and Hawley issued out sort of a release saying that the $3 to $5 billion FTC fine was a bargain. Is a bargain, could be a bargain to Facebook, i.e. it's not going to change behavior very much. Would you agree with that?
Again, it would be still the biggest fine ever. I think the substantive thing here is not the amount of money you fine, it's what kind of, Facebook has a significant problem with its internal privacy governance, in which it had a privacy team over in the corner who kind of spent a lot of time justifying the decisions the product team made and not building a framework for the substantive privacy decisions that have to be made. So Facebook needs to change how it does privacy governance. There's an opportunity here for the company to do what Microsoft did in 2002, which is completely change the way that people include privacy decisions in how they think about and develop products, in the same way Microsoft did with security and software. What the FTC needs to do is somehow encourage that kind of significant change of thinking of functionally how Facebook works. If they need a bigger fine for that, that's fine. I think it's easy for senators to say that because they don't actually have to go to court against Facebook. And I think the truth is that the FTC case against Facebook is much weaker than people think, because every privacy story about Facebook is about 30, 40% wrong. And so people are engaging with a kind of fantasy version of privacy issues at Facebook that the FTC doesn't get to take incorrect New York Times stories to court. They have to take real evidence to court. And so I think the FTC knows that if they lost a case against Facebook, it would be a massive problem for them. And so they're going to be more reasonable than members of Congress who can just say whatever they want without any downside. Right?
So let's broaden to topics in cybersecurity generally. Yeah. So I forewarned you, Alex, that I was going to do this with you. So a lightning round.
Lightning round.
Lightning round. True, false statements, but I've not given you the statements.
Okay.
So
true, false, or pass.
True, false, or pass, or call out to the audience.
Yeah.
And then your 10-second or 20-second reaction.
Okay, great.
True or false? The tech companies are appropriately prepared for the U.S. 2020 elections.
False. They are well prepared for what happened in 2016. I don't think we yet have the collaboration between tech companies necessary to adapt to what's going to happen in 2020.
In cybersecurity broadly, we are completely screwed, even more than we were last year.
False. We're not.
This, by the way, was a line from Jon Stewart from RSA, kind of saying, in essence, the problem is getting worse.
I hate this kind of nihilism that everything's bad and everything's worse. It's an easy thing to say as a security person. The truth is that there's two positive trends that are going the right way in security. One is the move to the cloud. So nobody here should run their own mail server, right? Nobody in the world is qualified to run secure email against a high-end adversary but Microsoft or Google. The fact that enterprises have finally stopped building on-site infrastructure and moving to the cloud is one big improvement. And the other is the mobilization of corporate IT. So iOS, Android, Chrome OS, the limited operating systems, that is a positive move. So there are some trends in cybersecurity that are going in the right direction.
80% of cybersecurity problems can be solved by getting the basics right.
Yes.
True. U.S. Cyber Command should have the authority to respond to attacks not just on the U.S. government, but then also on U.S. corporations. So this is like North Korea. North Korea attacks Sony.
Yeah.
The U.S. Cyber Command gets involved.
I would say true with caveats. I think one of our fundamental problems is that we have not established deterrence in cyberspace. So people ask, like, when is the cyber Pearl Harbor that's going to happen? We've had 20 cyber Pearl Harbors. Like, cyber wars, just we call it Tuesday, right? Like, the things that happen online between nation states and American companies on a normal Tuesday, we would never allow in the physical world. And so we have to start to ratchet up deterrence. I don't think Cyber Command by themselves are the appropriate people to do it. I think in my imaginary world where we have a functional presidency and a real national security council that is good on cybersecurity, this needs to come out of the White House.
CSOs, chief security officers, should be direct reports to CEOs in U.S. corporations.
I would say, yes, that is fine. I think the other option is to have a chief risk officer who supervises the CISO, who the chief risk officer reports to the CEO. But we have to, I think more important than direct reporting relationship is every large public company has a group of 20 people that actually run it. They're not necessarily direct reports to the CEO. They are the 20 people that are in the CEO's conference room at 10 a.m. on every Monday. The CISO needs to be in that room, whether or not they're a direct report, but they have to be in that room because that's where the big enterprise-defining risks are decided upon.
Yeah, it's the relationship and the trust that actually make more difference than the reporting relationship.
Which I've never been in that room, right? And that has been a problem multiple times in my career, and I don't know of any company where the CISO is in that room except a couple of banks.
Next one from a CSO herself. CSO actually stands for Chief Sacrificial Lamb Officer.
Yes. I like to joke that CISO is actually a Greek word that means the lamb that is slaughtered first. For a little ethnic humor. I don't have an Indo version of that, but anyway, yes. CISO's a crappy job. Being a CISO is a really bad job in 2019 because you have all of the responsibility and expectations of the CFO without any of the tools that CFOs have built over the last 50 years to understand and manage financial risk. We just, as an industry, we're so incredibly young. We don't have the tools that accountants have. And so you have all the responsibility and very little ability to even understand the risks that you've signed up for. Two more. Obviously, I don't like the job since I quit. So,
would you ever go back?
I have no desire to be a CISO again. No.
Oh, that says a lot. Okay, next one. Two more. This comes from a research report. 1 in 6 security leaders have alcohol or substance abuse, and the other 5 are not being fully truthful.
You think this is water? Is it? No, I mean, all the CISOs I know are incredibly stressed.
It's a stressful gig. It's a stressful gig. And last thing, security discussions at the board are still like accounting before GAAP.
Yeah, that's totally true. For 2 reasons. One, CISOs are not good at creating actionable feedback for the board, right? So it's very hard to go to the board, talk about risks in a way that they can do anything. All you can do is dump upon them all the bad stuff, and we don't have the mechanisms for them to be helpful. The second is almost no public board of directors have people that are actually qualified to oversee a CISO, right? And so, at Yahoo, I reported the audit committee. The audit committee were 3 very smart people with deep financial backgrounds. Like, one of the people was Charles Schwab, the man, like the actual man, Charles Schwab, right? Sure. Like, who's brilliant, who revolutionized investing, who's about 174 years old, and like realistically,
he was an investor in my last gig. So
okay, great. Yeah, I mean, he's a great guy, but realistically, like, there's just no way that he would be able to reasonably oversee this kind of risk. And so what I think is boards need to hire ex-CISOs and ex-CIOs, and boards need to build risk committees, technical risk committees that are separate from the audit committee. Because the audit committee, their job is about making sure there's no fraud. You need a technical risk committee that looks at all the other technical risks, including cybersecurity.
So I'm going to jump back to elections and then cover a couple more topics, and we're going to open up to the group and let the group ask questions.
Yeah.
So obviously at Facebook, you studied the Russian interference, the Russian sort of misinformation campaigns. Alex, do you think that the Russian misinformation campaign swayed at least 80,000 votes in those 3 swing states in favor of Trump?
I'm not qualified to answer that question. So a quick overview, there's 4 kinds of Russian interference in 2016. The first was the online social media campaign. That was, I think, very unlikely that swayed people because that was very diffuse. And the people they were targeting, on the left, it was things like Black Lives Matter activists. On the right, it's Christian conservatives. Those are not swing voters, right? When you're talking to people that believe that Satan is backing Hillary Clinton, they're not like, well, I want to look at the health plans before I make a decision, right? Like, that's about attacking the people on the radical sides, right?
Yes.
The second was probably the most important, which is the hack and leak campaign by the GRU. So that's the campaign to break into DCCC, DNC, Podesta's emails. Yes. And then those are intelligence professionals who used hundreds of thousands of leaked documents, who cherry-picked out of those documents to manipulate people, especially Bernie Sanders voters, to stay home on election day. There's a book by, if you're interested in this topic, a book by a actual social scientist, which is not me, named Kathleen Hall Jamieson. She's written a book that is all about the Russian interference, and from her, she believes she has quantitative evidence that the hack and leak campaign was effective in changing the way the media covered Hillary Clinton, and therefore had a indirect impact that was determinative on the election. The third interference was direct attacks against election infrastructure. There's no evidence that changed anything. That is the thing I'm most worried about 2020, that if a Democrat wins, the Russians are going to use intrusions into infrastructure to cast that victory into doubt, and we could end up with a Bush v. Gore or a House of Representatives.
And then the incumbent president sort of accelerates that message.
And then the fourth line of interference is like what's called the gray propaganda, which is RT, Sputnik, a bunch of that kind of stuff. Again, that's mostly aimed at true believers. I think it's not an effective way to change an election.
Let's jump to the Indian election, which may be near and dear to some of the folks in the audience, myself included. So there is a huge concern that this election in India becomes another WhatsApp election, like in Brazil. So there's 200 million WhatsApp users. And I won't mention the party, but the president of one of the parties in India was quoted last year saying, "Real or fake, we can make any message go viral."
Yes.
So, 1, is this a significant concern? And 2, what does one do about it?
Right. So the 2 big kind of fundamental issues in the Indian election that makes this hard to deal with. One is the propaganda is domestic, right? And so the policy reasoning behind aggressively protecting the U.S. election from Russia is that U.S. democracy should not be messed by Russians. You can decide that without taking any position on the political side, right? That is an easy thing to agree to. What is going on in India is that the political party, so especially the BJP and the Congress Party, I'll be a little less circumspect. The BJP and the Congress Party have both enrolled hundreds of thousands of people.
Like literally BJP, 900,000 is the plan.
Yeah, almost a million people that they have enrolled to be their propaganda spreaders. And so from a tech company perspective, this is much harder because these are legitimate Indians. They're domestic. They are intending that they want to spread this stuff. So they're not being fooled. They know what they're doing. And they are pushing messages on behalf of the political party they support. And they're doing so in a way that generally on WhatsApp, you have a lot less amplification than you do on Facebook, because on Facebook, you can post, one person can pretend to be 10 people who are running a fake anti-immigration group, and then you can use advertising to get millions of people to see that content. On WhatsApp, you have to forward it to your friends and family, right? And so it is a much lower amplification attack, but if you have 900,000 people, it doesn't matter that it's lower amplification because you can do it. So I think, and then the other thing that is fundamental is WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted, which I think is a good thing. The truth is if the companies were just totally responsible for stopping misinformation in India, that would mean dropping end-to-end encryption, violating the privacy of 200 million people, and using machine learning to look at everything everybody is saying, and then trying to stop them from spreading rumors. I think that is totally an inappropriate thing to do. I think India is the most, and I'm not just saying this because of the crowd, India is the most important country for the next 10 years on internet regulation. We talk about the US versus Europe, but the US and European legal systems are pretty aligned, and they are arguing about the edges of stuff. India is looking at the US model, the European model, the Chinese model, and is trying to forge its own way of its relationship with the internet and the internet companies. And what India decides is going to be determinative for Brazil, Indonesia, and all these other developing democracies. And this is a key challenge for the companies, because the people who are spreading the misinformation are the elected officials who are going to regulate them. And so I think in that model, if you're India, the best thing for you is to have to live with the disinformation, honestly, and have privacy, because the other option, we're entering a bipolar.
There's an argument that the users are smart. That the users, that the recipients of the mail in this case, the recipients of the message in this case are informed.
Yes.
They're not being duped.
Right, and that they choose to be in those conversations, right? And that's not always true. But the trade-off here is either we're entering this kind of Cold War where the United States and China are the countries that operate multi-billion person communication networks, and everybody else has to kind of choose their poison. And so you can choose the American poison of end-to-end encrypted with lots of potential chaos, like disinformation and rumors and such, or you pick the Chinese poison, which is use WeChat. The Chinese government gets a copy of everything said inside of your country. You now have absolutely no secrets from the People's Republic Ministry of State Security, and the flip side is you have control, right? And from my perspective, I think the more appropriate choice is to give privacy to individuals and then to help adapt your society to the fact that people have voice. Right? And there are things WhatsApp can do. They can reduce amplification capabilities. They can reduce the forwarding. I mean, they're doing some of that stuff. It's hard for them to know if it's effective because all of their data is anecdotal. Yeah. They don't have good hard data on prevalence that they can drive down. But from my perspective, I want them to be extremely careful, because the truth is white people in California should not be deciding what is appropriate political speech in India, right? Like, we might as well just get the pith helmets. It's like people use the term digital colonialism. That is the most digital colonialist thing I can think of, is white people here to decide like what is appropriate political speech for Indian people. That's ridiculous, and that should not be the standard that we sign up for.
Two last topics before I turn to questions. So let's jump to corporate security.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most important issue facing your peer group of chief security officers of large Fortune 100 kind of companies?
Right. So the biggest problem in security right now is there's just not enough staff, right? There's a gazillion security options out there. Most of them can only be deployed by a couple hundred companies. So if you look at the Fortune 500, there's probably 150 to 200 companies in the Fortune 500 that have good security teams, right? They have a technical CISO, they have support from executives, they have the ability to reverse engineer malware, they have their own instant responders, they have reasonably good logging. The rest of the Fortune 500 and most of the Russell 2000 are kind of screwed, right? And it's because there's not enough staff. So I was lucky, I had 127 people working for me. We had 500 and some engineers that we worked with on security issues. And at Facebook, I can recruit ex-NSA malware analysts, right? Because it's a sexy company, we pay a lot of money. God help you if you're the CISO of State Farm, right? Like, you're at the place where you are sitting on an amount of data that now is interesting. Marriott got hacked by the Chinese because things like hotel records are really useful from a human intelligence perspective. So many companies are now playing at the same level that it was only Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics 10 years ago, and now everybody has to be at that level, but we don't have the staffing. And so if you're, as investors and entrepreneurs, I would not invest in a security company that did not have a services component or wasn't cloud native right now. Because what's going on is everybody targets the same 100, 200 companies. Those people are saturated with security solutions. And then everybody else is screwed because they can't take, so this is like the FireEye example. FireEye was doing great for a long period of time, and then they realized they ran out of companies that could actually deploy their box. Because a FireEye box spits out like a 12-page report on the reverse engineering of a Windows PE file. And here are the imports, and here's all of this technical detail, and Google and Facebook and Lockheed Martin have people who can read that, but State Farm does not. And that's why FireEye had to buy Mandiant, and that's why you're going to see. So what I would like to see is more combined managed service companies with good technology that allows for amplification, where you can have a small number of people manage hundreds of thousands of machines. It's not about dealing with the high end, it's about making people more efficient is the biggest issue in security right now.
We have time for maybe one or two questions. I see there's a mic up here.
With your expertise, sir, where do you see this going in the 5-10 years into the future?
I mean, I have no idea. If I had that kind of foresight, I wouldn't have to work anymore, right?
Well, you're at Stanford, Alex. Give us one glimpse.
Look,
give us one glimpse.
Where are things going? On the election stuff, the future of disinformation is domestic, right? So what you're going to see is, for all the focus on Russia, US, that is a very specific situation. We're going to see lots of countries with the political parties taking the Russian playbook, or the BJP playbook, and playing that playbook domestically. So that's one of the things we're studying at Stanford. We're building this whole thing called the Internet Observatory, and one of the things I'm really interested in is the developing world of how the internet affects their democracies, because we spend too much time thinking about the US and Russia. So I think that's going to have to happen. The truth is our society is going to have to. We have gone through an information revolution equivalent to the invention of the printing press, equivalent to the introduction of television and radio, right? The printing press gave us 200 years of war in Europe, from Martin Luther and the creation of the Reformation. So we've given billions of people supercomputers with always-on connections. We're going to have to change our societies to deal with that, and we've done it before. Just hopefully we can cut the corner and not have a couple hundred years of horrible bloodshed before we do so. But I think what we're facing is an information revolution of the same level that we have faced only 4 or 5 times as a human society. Yes, sir.
I said I just want to understand what kind of circumstances cause things like passwords to be stored in clear text in Facebook, which is what I heard in the news. I'm not sure how much it's true.
Right, so that was a bug that I missed and somebody else in the back missed that lasted for a long period of time. So Facebook actually has one of the best official password storage mechanisms I've ever seen, a password onion of really, really good encryption and credential storage. The problem Facebook has is that its entire engineering culture is that every engineer has access to the source code and can modify any part of Facebook and have access to any part. Like nothing is nobody else's problem is one of the posters. That made sense at 500 engineers. It makes much less sense at 5,000 engineers. And the company is going through growing pains of how do you let engineers have a huge amount of freedom without them creating security flaws. And the traditional way of doing that is you do it through automation to catch it, and that's something that wasn't being looked at. Nobody was intentionally storing password flaws. This is actually a very, very common mistake, which is creating a logging framework that logs post parameters and doesn't specifically look for passwords. So Facebook has an official logging framework that solves this problem. One engineer decided, I'm going to create my own logging on this cluster of machines, forgot about it, and then all that data was being written out for years, and then collectively it was a very slow leak, but over 8 years, it turned into a bunch of passwords that were sitting there. The actual impact on people is zero. There's no evidence that anybody ever saw it, but it's a great example of when you allow thousands of engineers to do their own development, you have to have extremely good controls over what they're doing. And then the other thing Facebook needs is they need a better job of understanding what's in the data warehouse, because that's, I think, how this got caught, is that something we started when I was there, is we started really trying to clean up all of the data pools. And so if you're building a company, you've got petabyte scale data warehouses, or exabyte scale in Facebook's case, you have to have automated systems that tell you what's there.
Right, so fantastic chat.
Right.
Everybody, please join me in thanking.
Everybody,
please join me in thanking Alex.